had a wonderful time there
Really?
70 years ago.
Wow.
I was not quite there, but on the other side of the border. I went to the Casals concerts in Prague. Pablo Casals was running concerts in Prague and Perpignan. Wonderful. He was playing the Bach suites solo. He refused to go to Spain as long as Franco was in power, so he stayed right across the border. And the concerts were amazing, but I spent some time wandering around the beautiful area there.
Hello, my name is Pablo Risotto, and welcome everyone to today's webinar with Professor Noam Chomsky. He is widely recognized as the most renowned intellectual of our time, so I guess he needs no further introduction. Regarding the title of the talk, the responsibility of intellectuals, is as pertinent today as it was in 1966 when Professor Chomsky delivered his seminal lecture at Harvard University in the context of the Vietnam War, a lecture that was published a year later and still resonates today. So, Professor Chomsky, thank you for joining us today and taking the time to talk to us. It is a privilege to have you here, and we are all looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this topic.
Very pleased to be with you.
Let me begin by mentioning that it has been more than 50 years since you first described two different kinds of intellectuals. Those who speak the truth and expose lies, and those who provide expert services and justifications to the powerful. Very similar to the role of mass media in creating the necessary illusions to manufacture consent within the public. So the question is, which one prevails today and how have we got here?
It's not just today, it's throughout history, as far back as you go. So the term intellectual was pretty much began to be used in its current sense for the first time at the time of the Dreyfus trial in France. Dreyfus was, of course, convicted on fabricated evidence, sent off to a prison island. There were people in France who objected. People like Émile Zola, for example, with his J'accuse, they're called the Dreyfusards. They were called themselves critical intellectuals. They were bitterly condemned and denounced. We honor them today, but not at the time. In fact, Zola was forced to flee France. The immortals, the intellectuals of the Académie Française, bitterly denounce these writers and artists who dare to criticize our noble state and army and its wonderful institutions. That's the norm. That's the norm that goes as far back in history as you like. You can trace it back to classical Greece. Who was forced to drink the hemlock? Well, the person who was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking too many questions. Roughly the same time in the biblical record, the oral traditions of the biblical record, there were people who are called prophets. It's a bad translation of an obscure word. They were basically from our framework, critical intellectuals, criticizing the king's atrocities, calling for mercy for widows and orphans, giving geopolitical analysis showing that the king was leading the country to disaster. How were they treated? Driven into the desert, imprisoned. There were people who were honored, the flatterers at the court. Centuries later, they were condemned as false prophets, centuries later, just like the Dreyfusards. And that runs right through history. The task of intellectuals overwhelmingly has been to service of power. In fact, let me give you a current illustration, which is kind of interesting. Very soon, we're going to be commemorating the 50th anniversary of the decision to the agreement to end the war in Vietnam, agreement in Paris between the United States and North Vietnam 50 years ago. So we'll be soon hearing a lot about it. There is just appeared a major scholarly book. It'll be the standard scholarly source on the Nixon-Kissinger years, 500 pages of dense analysis and so scholarly analysis. Carolyn Eisenberg. So what does she say about this? It's just a throwaway line. She says, Kissinger was doing the essential work for the president, which was to disseminate in a convincing manner the false account of what had transpired in Paris. And it's just one case. The book is full of hundreds of examples. But that's the task of intellectuals, to provide in a convincing manner a false account of those in power. And Kissinger himself, who's of course an expert in this, was quite frank about it. He said the role of the intellectual is to articulate clearly the consensus of those in power. That those are the false prophets, the flatterers at the court, the ones who are honored and respected, not driven into the desert or imprisoned. How the critical intellectuals are treated depends on the nature of the society. So the United States, a very free society, so there's not going to be secret police coming in to drag me away from saying this. For people, there can be severe punishment, not like the totalitarian state. People lose their jobs, they're marginalized, they're vilified, condemned. They're what George Bundy, the national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, called wild men in the wings who dare to question our motives and strategy instead of just keeping to tactical decisions. That's the norm. And you see it on any issue you look at. I mean, take the Vietnam War. It's a long time. You'd think it would be possible to talk about it. Try to find one comment anywhere near the mainstream that says it's a massive crime, in fact, the worst crime since the Second World War, which it obviously is. Can't find it. What you can find is it was a misguided attempt to bring democracy to Vietnam. Okay, that's the false prophets. They're well ensconced. Nothing's changed.
Right. And could you comment on who should we consider intellectuals and whether the primary focus should be on speaking the truth to either the powerful or the powerless?
Intellectuals are people who are privileged enough, like you and me, to be able to spend time developing insight and understanding and to reach people to some extent with their own opinions. If you have that degree of privilege, you can be called an intellectual. It may be that the storekeeper where you buy your groceries has deeper insight and better understanding than you do, but that person's not an intellectual. They don't have the privilege and the status. And plenty of people who are called intellectuals basically do clerical work. That's a lot of what law scholarship is. But it's a matter of power and privilege and the way you make use of it. As to, there is a slogan that you should talk truth to power. People I respect, Quakers, for example, hold that view. I think that's a mistake. There's no point talking truth to power. You don't have to tell the truth to Henry Kissinger. He knows it very well. Furthermore, we don't know the truth. We have our opinions We're not angels. We have a certain grasp of things. Here's our point of view. So we shouldn't be talking what we call truth to the powerful who just ridicule us properly. We should be engaging with the powerless and not telling them the truth, but encouraging them to find out what's happening in the world, encourage them to pursue their capacities, which they of course have, to inquire, to study, to investigate, and help create the organizational systems in which they can do it. It's kind of been forgotten now, but go back a century, the labor movement, a core part of the labor movement was adult education. People should be provided all through their lives with educational opportunities. I mean, I'm old enough to remember this from the 1930s when most of my family, first generation immigrants, were unemployed working class, but they were in unions. And the unions were not just efforts to raise wages, they were cultural institutions, concerts, education classes, discussion groups. That was part of what it meant to be in a union, was to be part of an ongoing lively culture. And the task of those privileged enough to be considered intellectuals is to contribute to that, as in fact they did in the 1930s. So leading intellectuals, scientists like J.D. Bernal and others were giving workers' education courses in the unions. One of the main colleges in England, Birkbeck College, was founded as a working class college. People like Eric Hobsbawm, great historian, taught there, and basically trying to reach working people. That's part of the commitment of those lucky enough to be considered intellectuals.
Makes sense. Professor Chomsky, you have argued that well-informed and engaged public is essential for democracy. However, fake news, misinformation, and conspiracy theories are increasingly shaping public opinion. Moreover, the control of mass media and social media remains in the hands of a few large corporations, and whistleblowers are harshly punished for disclosing information, even if it's true. So the question, I guess, is what is your view on the health of our democracies in the light of these facts?
Well, it's a problem, but is it new? Take the example I gave 50 years ago when Henry Kissinger was pursuing his essential task of providing fake news to the public on the negotiations in Paris that formally ended the war in Vietnam. Is that fake news? It wasn't called fake news in those days. It was just called performing the essential service of deceiving the public. In the case of Kissinger, as a total cynic, of course, it was conscious. But for most intellectuals, it's just not conscious. You just accept the framework, the standard framework of ideology, and you present the information about the world, the history, and within that framework. It's just, you don't question it. If you start to question it, you're a wild man in the wings, then you can get in trouble. So it's not conscious deceit. Now it's different, you're quite right. Now there are industries producing fake news. Of course, that makes it much more difficult. And they're very effective. In fact, they may wipe us out. I'll give you an example. Now, there's two huge problems that humans face today. They don't solve these problems, we're finished. One of them is the growing threat of nuclear war. Another is the failure to deal with the ongoing devastating crisis of environmental destruction. You don't deal with those two things, nothing else matters. That's why the doomsday clock a couple of days ago was moved to 90 seconds to midnight, those two issues. Well, there was just a poll that came out by the major polling agency in the United States, Pew Polling Agency, asking people to list, it gave them a set of choices, a couple dozen choices of urgent issues, what really matters. Nuclear war wasn't even on the list. That's so low, you don't talk about it. Climate change was on the list. It was down at the bottom of concern. For Republicans, almost nobody was concerned. Well, why? Only the most important issues that have ever risen in human history. People don't hear anything about it. What they hear, both even from the mainstream, but particularly from these fake news institutions, was they hear it's not happening. Who cares about nuclear war? It's nothing that happens, not to us. Climate change just invented by liberals. There's no climate change. That's the Republican Party party line. So you hear that all the time. You say, who cares? Let's march to the precipice and destroy ourselves. These are not small issues. It's issues of whether humans are even going to survive. And in the near future, same with many other questions.
Very insightful indeed, yeah. Also, well-informed and engaged scholars are considered essential for science, at least for good science. However, Sci-Hub, a well-known website that provides unrestricted access to all scientific knowledge ever published, I don't know if you know it, remains controversial. And the main reason is because it threatens the profits of large editorial companies that keep the scientific knowledge behind paywalls. In fact, the last news I heard is that its creator remains in hiding and facing charges of copyright infringement and a $15 million fine. So could you share your thoughts on this matter?
Well, it's not a simple matter. In a decent society, scientific information should be publicly available. And to some extent it is within the scientific community. So if you're in say my field or any research field, most of what you're doing is work that's posted online. It gets published maybe later for the record, but if you're doing ongoing live research, a lot of it is just basically discussion, means online, but it doesn't reach the public. Well, what about the journals and the publishing houses? You can say, let's let all information be public. But if you do that, nothing's going to be public because the institutions won't be there. If you don't have journals, you can't publish in journals. If you don't have publishing houses, you can't publish books. So yes, if you let it all be free, they all go out of business and nothing appears. That's a social problem. It's a problem for our social institutions, which requires that scientific and artistic and creative work be funneled through private institutions in order to reach the public. That's a social and economic problem. It's about on a par with, say, to deal with the climate crisis. We can't just say, let's stop using fossil fuels. We have to bribe the fossil fuel companies to pay them enough so maybe they'll stop poisoning us. It's totally insane, of course, but that's the nature of our social and political structures. So you want to go to the root, you have to go to that. But you can't deal with the symptoms. Publishing, if it's made totally free as it should be, will basically stop dissemination of information because the private institutions won't be there. So what we need is to reconstruct the way in which the whole information system works. It goes to the public, it's available to the public without the intermediary of private power. It's a problem that arises all through the society, not just in this case.
Right. it has been argued that the responsibility of intellectuals, at least to tell the truth and expose lies, has been abdicated, at least in part due to the decline of academic freedom, with universities functioning as corporations, with an emphasis on short-term commercial value in scientific work, overwhelming paperwork, or shrinking tenure. But despite all this, partnership between public universities and private companies are often promoted as mutually beneficial. So what is your opinion on this?
Well, I mean, talk about the United States and Britain, which are a little bit different from the rest, and I know better, of course. In the 1960s, there was, of course, as you know, an uprising of independent activism and thought. A lot of young people were questioning lots of accepted ways of thinking and ideas. It had a major civilizing effect on the society. Things that were taken for granted in the 1950s and 60s, you couldn't even say today. That's major change. Well, there was a backlash. Elite elements didn't like that. Liberal and conservative, across the board, was bipartisan, whole range. At the kind of what's called in the United States liberal, social democratic in European terms, social democratic end, there was a call to condemnation of universities, I'm quoting, for failure to indoctrinate the young. Universities were not indoctrinating the young properly. That's why they were in the streets protesting the Vietnam War, calling for women's rights, gay rights, and so on. That's the left end. The right was much harsher. One effect of that was to start undermining universities. One thing that began to happen is that tuitions shot up. College in the United States had been virtually free before then, but now it's a huge burden. Go to college, you have huge debt when you come out. That's has a disciplinary effect, obviously. And maybe you want to be a public interest lawyer, but you're just going to have to go into a corporate law firm, and it holds across the board. Also, a business model was imposed on universities. So lots of administrators, lots of controls, get rid of tenure, defund the universities, let them depend more on private funding and so on. It's had a big effect on cheapening and vulgarizing university life. England, the same, under the Tory party, conservative parties, when British critic Stefan Collini pointed out correctly that the Tory government is trying to turn first-class universities into third-class commercial enterprises. So if Oxford wants to have a classics department, they have to show that they can sell it on the market. Otherwise, why should you have a classics department? Well, all of these things are happening. They're part of the whole neoliberal assault on the general social order, which has been quite harsh and brutal. And this is part of just disciplining young people, making sure that you can indoctrinate the young properly. Hasn't really worked too well, but it's caused lots of problems. So yes, those are, again, it's not just intellectuals and universities. This is an aspect of a much broader problem about the whole way in which in the past 40 years, what we call neoliberalism, basically kind of class war, has tried to crush and control the great mass of the population in the interests of small sectors of private power.
Right. Before ending this interview, just a couple of questions from two special guests. Nacho Casado, activist from Extinction Rebellion, and Professor Asier Arias, who co-authored a recent article on intellectual honesty with you, actually. So let me unmute.
Hello, Pablo. Hello, Professor Chomsky. Well, first of all, let me say that I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to talk to you today. And I am very thankful to you for your time and for your generosity. I would like now to put the emphasis on activism and direct action and how this is regarded by the wider society. In the last months, we have seen activists deeply concerned about climate change and environmental destruction, throwing tomato soup at works of art and causing disruption inside museums. Many people, even within the academia, have claimed they are going too far, suggesting young people should find other ways of protest. So my question would be, how can we understand this response from the public, given the severity of the crisis we are living in? And how can we explain these harsh comments of ordinary people and intellectuals on the actions of young protesters?
It's the same. It's the same always. Go back to the Vietnam War again. When there were protests in the streets, the elite intellectuals, for the most part, elite sectors generally, condemned them. They condemned the protesters, not the war. You should be polite, quiet, passive, obedient, be responsible, what's called, not disrupt things. Well, from the point of view of activists, you have to ask a serious question that activists constantly have to ask themselves. You can understand the anger, the resentment about the failure to deal with things and so on. That's completely understandable. But activists have to make a distinction between doing good and feeling good. They're different. You can do things that make you feel good and that the situation merits and deserves. So people are being slaughtered in Vietnam, I'll break store windows. That makes you feel good. But does it do good? Well, there you have to ask, what's the effect on the audience that you're trying to reach? If the effect of the audience is to induce more support for violence and destruction, doesn't matter if you feel good. Actually, I remember discussions back in the 1950s. It was possible to discuss these issues with Vietnamese, not in the United States, of course, but we could meet in Paris, let's say. And there were interesting discussions in which young Americans were calling for violent acts to protest the hideous atrocities of the war. And the Vietnamese were telling them, don't do that. You should do mild things. I remember meetings where people, women from South Vietnam whose society was being totally wiped out, would tell the Americans, what we admire is when a group of women stood beside the graves of American soldiers, just mourning. That's what they think you should be doing. For the Americans, that's outlandish. We can't just do that. We've got to do something serious. Well, those are the voices of the victims. They don't care how you feel. They care what the consequences are. And those are things you always have to keep in mind. So you can easily understand why young people would be so overwhelmed with fury about the failure to prevent the destruction of their lives, that they would throw tomato soup at paintings. But you have to ask yourself, what's the effect given the actual circumstances? Well, the lesson of the Vietnamese, I think, is one that should be kept in mind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Professor Chomsky. It's an incredible honor. And I would like to switch to another topic where the behavior of our intellectual class is being worthy of comment, the war in Ukraine. Some scholars have argued with some merit, in my view, that the spectrum of acceptable opinion in European media has been even narrower compared with the US, compared to the US. Here in Spain, it has been fascinating to observe the divide between the intellectual elite and mass media on the one hand, and independent outlets on the other. I'm sure that there is no need to explain which side of that line you can find in-depth analysis of the general framework of the conflict and serious commentary on Western involvement in it. Anyway, one might ask, why have European ruling elites enthusiastically followed by our local cultural commissars succumbed to control by the US, heading towards social, economic, and ecological cliff?
You're asking why European elites are even more subordinate to the US propaganda line than in the United States. Is that
Yeah, that's
very
the bottom line.
It's true. I have lots of discussions and interviews and talks in Europe and the United States, of course, and in the rest of the world, global South. Spain, to some extent, is like the South. It's more open. But in Germany, France, of course, Britain, the discussion is extremely narrow and very subordinated to US power, which is quite an interesting phenomenon because Europe is suffering from the war. The United States is benefiting from it, benefiting enormously. First of all, US industries are making enormous profits. Military industry, fossil fuel industries, displacing Europe. The whole Europe the economy has been based on a sophisticated German-based industrial system spreading from the Netherlands to Slovakia. It was all highly reliant on their natural trading partner, which is to the east, resource-rich Russia has minerals, oil, and so on. So it's a very natural trading relationship. And in fact, if you look through the whole Cold War, there has always been tension as to whether Europe will strike an independent course and integrate with its resource-rich commercial trading partner to the east, or whether it'll stay subordinate to the United States. Charles de Gaulle was the leading spokesperson for independence and integration. Willy Brandt in Germany with his Ostpolitik. The United States, of course, was always calling for subordination to the United States within the NATO framework. That you get to the end of the Cold War, Mikhail Gorbachev proposed what he called a common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok with no military alliances, moving towards a kind of common social democratic future. The United States, of course, didn't like that. Wants the Atlanticist system with Europe subordinated to NATO, which of course run by the United States. In contemporary intellectual discussion, there's a conflict between what's called a rules-based international order and a UN-based international order. China, in Russia, India, Indonesia, major global South, they want a UN-based order. The United States and England, it has to be a rules-based order. That's close to 100% of discussion. And what is a rule-based order? Well, who sets the rules? You don't answer that question, but it's obvious. The rules are set by the United States. So we want a rules-based order, meaning we run the show. Well, one effect of Putin's criminal invasion of Ukraine was to hand Europe to the United States on a silver platter, to put Europe deep into the pocket of the United States to their own detriment. They're suffering. They may move to deindustrialization, literally. It's not just Europe, incidentally, it's also China. So it's not talked about much, but the United States has now virtually declared war on China. It's committed publicly and openly to preventing Chinese economic development. And the way the United States does it is because of its control over Europe and Japan. United States is trying to force Europe and Japan to get out of the China market with advanced technology. That'll be a very severe blow to Europe. I mean, the major chip manufacturer in the world happens to be in the Netherlands. If they're barred from the China market, they suffer severely. But the United States is demanding that. We'll see if Netherlands succumbs. Japan, the same thing, South Korea. There's a major international conflict going on. And what you're describing is one part of it. Well, so far, European elites have almost completely subordinated themselves to US propaganda. As you say, there's more discussion of this in the United States than there is in Europe. It's not true of the populations. If you look at polls in Europe, maybe 70% of Germans think you should move towards negotiations. You try to say that publicly, you're practically murdered. You're a Putin lover, this and that, appeasement and so on. But, and this is a struggle that's going on. Will Europe agree to undermine itself, maybe even move to deindustrialization in order to hang on to Washington's coattails? That's basically what's going on right now. I think it's interesting to look at the rest of the world. There is a world out there outside of Europe, though Europeans don't like to believe it. India, Indonesia, these are countries. They have South Africa, Brazil, have their own beliefs. There's a big furor in the United States now because the newly elected president of Brazil, Lula, is visiting the United States. And he informed Washington that Brazil is not going to send arms to NATO for the war. A big uproar. That's the position of the whole world. But you don't know it because that doesn't get reported. But they don't want to take part in, most of the world doesn't want to take part in what they see as a proxy war between the US and Russia over Ukrainian bodies. That's not part of that. And of course, they just collapse in ridicule when they hear the lofty rhetoric about defending democracy and human rights and international law and so on. I mean, they've had enough experience to not bother with that. But it sells in the closed European circles where people, intellectuals, repeat these ridiculous phrases without laughing. But this little European bubble, intellectual bubble, is very different from the rest of the world. Spain is kind of on the border, I should say. I've seen more discussion in Spain than, say, in Germany or England. But that's always been true of Spain. It's been somewhat less integrated into the Central European ideological system for all kinds of reasons. But these are major battles going on in the world now. They'll determine the shape of world order. And I think what you're describing is just one piece of it. My own guess is that sooner or later, Europe, meaning Germany mainly, will recognize that they can't destroy themselves just by continuing to follow US orders within the Atlanticist system. And notice that what's happening. Take a look at the latest NATO summit. The latest NATO summit was very interesting. For the first time, NATO invited Asian countries to participate. US, US client states in Asia, Japan, South Korea were invited to NATO, and NATO officially extended its mission to the Indo-Pacific. Means the North Atlantic now includes all the world, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Oceans, all part of the North Atlantic. Well, that's part of the US effort to sustain its declining international power, and Europe's going along with it, as we saw at NATO. But for how long, and how much will the German-based European system be willing to suffer in order to, while subordinating itself to Washington? Interesting question.
Professor Chomsky, indeed, it seems we have formidable challenges ahead of us. I just want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been truly an honor to talk to you. And we all appreciate your commitment on critical thinking, on intellectual honesty, and your compromise towards a fair and democratic society. Thank you, Nacho and Asier, as well, for your kind collaboration, and to all the attendees for your attention. We look forward to seeing you all again next week in a new webinar of Conciencia del Comportamiento.es. And I hope you have a good day. Thank you very much, Noam Chomsky.
Very much. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure.